April 17, 1945, a few miles outside Nuremberg. The war was ending, but the hunger was not. The American camp sat on a stretch of churned farmland where frost still clung to the soil, the wind carrying the smell of wet earth and smoke from barns long burned down. The shooting had stopped days ago, yet the sound of it seemed to hang in the air, as if the fields themselves remembered. Corporal James Red Dawson stood beside the wire fence, watching the line of German prisoners shuffle forward for roll call. They were not soldiers anymore, just shadows in tattered uniforms, silent, swaying. Most were women from the auxiliary units, captured when the roads south closed. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunk deep, skin gray beneath layers of dust. The guards joked to pass the time, but Dawson couldn't find it in him to laugh. His boots were caked with the same mud that clung to the prisoners' skirts, and the smell of rot and sickness made the morning coffee turn sour in his stomach. A sergeant barked orders, his voice cutting through the weak light. One of the women stumbled, her knees giving way. "Get up," he shouted, but she stayed down, too weak to move. Another woman tried to help her, but the sergeant waved them apart. "Leave her. She'll learn." The others looked away. Dawson's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching near his cheek. He'd seen prisoners collapse before, on the road, on the trucks, in the holding yards, but there was something different here. The war was done. There was no fight left in anyone, yet cruelty still lingered like a habit no one could shake. The camp was supposed to be temporary, just a holding ground before transport north. That's what they told him when they assigned him guard duty, simple work for a few weeks until redeployment. But temporary had stretched into months, and the supplies never matched the orders. The Americans ate from crates of canned beans and white bread, while the prisoners lived on whatever could be scraped from leftover rations. Someone had decided that since the war was won, feeding the enemy wasn't urgent. Dawson had heard it from the quartermaster himself, "They can go a few days without, won't kill him." But as he watched the line of women sway under the thin April sun, he wondered if maybe it would. He turned from the fence and walked toward the supply trucks. The mud sucked at his boots. He passed a soldier smoking near the mess tent who called out, "Cowboy, you going to rustle up some grub for the ladies?" The tone was mocking, but Dawson didn't bite. He just adjusted his hat, the one piece of home he still carried from Texas, and kept walking. Inside the truck, the air smelled of gasoline and flour dust. Stacks of boxes lined the interior, beans, coffee, sugar, more than enough for the camp. He reached for the logbook on the tailgate. The last entry for prisoner rations was 4 days old. 4. He let the number sit in his head. That evening, the sky went purple over the low hills. Smoke from the cook fires drifted through camp, and laughter rose from the Americans' tents. Someone had found a bottle of schnapps, someone else played a harmonica. The sound grated against the silence from the wire fence. The women huddled close together, trying to warm their hands over a candle stub. Dawson sat by the fire with his mess tin untouched. Across from him, Sergeant O'Leary tore bread in half and said, "You're thinking too hard, cowboy. Don't." These girls wore the same uniform that shot our boys in Normandy. Dawson didn't answer. He knew O'Leary wasn't a bad man, just emptied out by too much killing. But the line between enemy and human blurred more each day, and Dawson couldn't tell any more which side of it he stood on. He glanced toward the fence. In the flicker of lamplight, he could see one of the women's faces pressed against the wire, pale as wax. She was young, maybe his age, hair tangled, lips cracked. She didn't cry or beg, just stared, hollow and still, until a guard shouted for her to back away. Later that night, the wind picked up, rattling the tin roofs of the tents. Dawson tried to sleep but couldn't. The image of that face stayed with him. He could hear the faint coughing from the women's quarters, sharp and dry like wood snapping. He sat up, lit a cigarette, and stared at the glow in his hand. His stomach twisted. He'd been in France when they liberated the camps, had seen what starvation looked like when it finished its work. He thought they'd learned something then. Maybe not. He walked outside, the cold biting through his coat. The stars were dim through the haze. From the fence line came the sound of someone groaning softly, then quiet again. He approached, boots crunching on frost. The young woman lay half-conscious near the post, her body curled tight, breath shallow. A tin cup sat beside her, empty but for muddy water. Dawson crouched down, his breath steaming in the air. She opened her eyes for a moment, dull blue in the dark, then closed them again. He stayed there a long minute staring at her face. The rules were simple: no contact, no special treatment. Orders were clear. But orders had no place in that silence. He looked back toward the American tents, where the laughter had already faded. The firelight flickered on the canvas, warm and steady. He could have gone back. Instead, he found himself whispering under his breath, words meant for no one, "What the hell are we doing?" He stood and walked back toward the supply truck, the decision already forming without language. The mud swallowed his steps. Behind him, the camp settled into its uneasy sleep, the fences drawing hard lines between the fed and the starving. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang once, faint and broken. By the time he reached the truck, the night was quiet again. He placed his hand on the cold metal door and paused. For days without food, he repeated it silently, as if saying it enough times might make it less true. It didn't. He opened the door, the hinges groaning like something alive. Inside, the crates waited, full and untouched. He lit another match, its light trembling against the wood. The label on one box read Rations, Type C, U.S. Army. Enough to fill every stomach in the camp if someone cared enough to sign it out. He stared at it until the match burned his fingers and went out. Then he closed the door again and stood in the dark, the decision waiting like a loaded gun inside his chest. The next morning came with the kind of sunrise only Texas could make, wide, golden, and endless. Dew clung to the barbed wire fences like silver beads, and the air carried the faint scent of horses and warm bread. From the small wooden barracks, the Japanese women emerged hesitantly, blinking in the bright light. Some had barely slept. The silence of the night before had been too strange, too gentle to trust. Across the yard, cowboys moved with unhurried purpose. Their spurs clinked softly as they hauled sacks of grain and filled troughs for livestock. To them, the camp wasn't so different from the ranches they'd worked before the war, just more fences and more rules. The war, after all, had taken their brothers and cousins to Europe and the Pacific. Now these men, too old or too needed at home, were serving their country in their own peculiar way, by guarding former enemies with ropes, horses, and a good-natured shrug. It was an arrangement no one could have predicted: Japanese women prisoners of war on American soil, watched over by men who looked like they'd stepped out of a dime novel. When breakfast was served, the contrast deepened. The women expected rations, perhaps watery soup or stale rice. Instead, they received eggs, biscuits, and even a slice of peach each, from a crate marked Hill County Co-op, 1945. They sat quietly at the long wooden tables, eyes fixed on the food as though it might vanish. A cowboy leaned against the post nearby watching. "Guess they ain't had biscuits like that where they come from," he said softly. Another replied, "Reckon we barely have biscuits like that here neither." The women began to whisper among themselves. They had seen America from the sky through bombs and fire, but never like this. It wasn't a land of hate, it was a place of ordinary decency and dust. Later that morning, one of the women, identified later in Japanese archives as Lieutenant Nurse Keiko Tanaka, approached the fence where a cowboy was fixing a broken post. She bowed deeply before speaking. "Why kind?" she asked in careful English. He straightened, surprised, wiping sweat from his brow. "Ma'am," he said with a half-smile he was done. "Ain't no sense bein' mean to ghosts." That answer stayed with her for the rest of her life. The camp wasn't a typical military installation. It had been a livestock facility before the Army leased it in 1942 to hold German POWs. By the time the Japanese women arrived, much of it had reverted to civilian management. The cowboys worked under the War Department's Reconstruction Supply Division, contracted to maintain food and animals for the post-war recovery effort. Some were veterans, others were young men who had been deferred from service to keep the farms alive. According to surviving War Department records, humane treatment of prisoners was not just a policy, it was a point of pride. The United States wanted to show the world that even in victory, it could act with dignity. "The well-fed prisoner," one memo stated, "is a living advertisement of American principles." And so, through a strange mix of bureaucracy and Texas hospitality, the women found themselves the beneficiaries of America's post-war conscience. Over the following days, an awkward rhythm developed. The women kept mostly to themselves, sewing or washing clothes in silence. The cowboys, unsure what to say, maintained a respectful distance. But curiosity worked both ways. Occasionally, one of the women would peek through the fence to watch a cowboy saddle his horse. The way he moved, calm, confident, unhurried, was unlike anything they had seen in soldiers. There was strength, but not aggression, authority, but not dominance. One afternoon, a small incident broke the invisible wall between them. A horse broke loose from its pen, kicking up dust and galloping across the yard. The women froze, unsure what was happening, but before anyone could shout, two of them instinctively grabbed a fallen rope and ran toward the fence, motioning where the animal would turn. A cowboy noticed and, laughing, used their gestures to corner the horse. When the animal was safely caught, he tipped his hat toward the women and said, "Fine teamwork, ladies." They laughed, quietly at first, then fully. It was the first time laughter had been heard in that camp. The cowboys, amused by the women's precision and quick thinking, started calling them the nurses with cavalry hearts. The women, in turn, began greeting the men with shy bows each morning. One cowboy taught them to say a howdy, and they repeated it so carefully it sounded like a ritual. The cultural exchanges were small but powerful. When one woman admired a cowboy's harmonica, he handed it to her. She pressed it to her lips and produced a sound so faint it made everyone laugh. "Needs more wind than that," he said kindly, showing her how. Soon, at night, the women could be heard practicing softly inside the barracks, the notes uneven but hopeful. It was in these details that something remarkable happened. The myths began to dissolve. The women, who had been raised to believe Americans were brutal conquerors, found men who held doors open for them and apologized if they spoke too loudly. The cowboys, who had only known Japan through newspaper caricatures, discovered women who stitched torn gloves for them in secret. In one entry from Keiko's diary, translated decades later by historians, she wrote, "They treated us like tired travelers, not prisoners. I began to think perhaps kindness was stronger than war." But kindness didn't erase the past, it simply softened its edges. One evening, a cowboy found one of the women crying near the fence. She had received word from another camp that her brother, a Japanese soldier, had died in a U.S. hospital. Unsure what to do, the cowboy offered her a small piece of paper. It was a drawing, just a sketch of the Texas plains and the rising sun. He's part of that now," he said quietly. "The big sky's got room for everybody." The moment needed no translation. By the middle of September, the women had begun helping around the camp, sweeping, cooking, tending to small chores. It was less about obligation and more about gratitude. The cowboys joked that they had the politest guests west of the Mississippi. Humor, in its dry Texan way, helped bridge what diplomacy couldn't. When a sandstorm swept through the camp one afternoon, covering everything in orange dust, one of the cowboys muttered, "Welcome to paradise, ladies." To his surprise, the women burst out laughing. One replied in broken English, "Paradise, too much sand." That laughter echoed through the barracks for hours. Even historians who later examined the camp's brief existence noted something unusual. In a time when the wounds of war were still open, the Texas camp became an accidental experiment in humanity. The guards' easy manners, born not of training but of rural decency, created an atmosphere that confounded expectations on both sides. That night, the camp held its breath. The usual noise, the shouting, the boots, the barked orders, had fallen away into something quieter, heavier. The frost crept back in, silvering the edges of the barbed wire and stiffening the ground. Inside the small infirmary tent, Dawson sat beside the cot where the German woman lay asleep. The lantern light flickered across her face, sharp bones and sunken eyes softened by exhaustion. Every now and then she twitched, as if still flinching from something far away. He didn't know her name. None of them did. The Red Cross tags had been lost before the march, and the women had come in like ghosts, no ranks, no numbers, just shapes and rags. Dawson had fed her twice more that evening, little more than spoonfuls, and she'd finally fallen into a real sleep. The doctor had come by, said she might live if infection didn't take her. Then he'd looked at Dawson and muttered, "You'll catch hell for this, you know." "I already have," Dawson said, and the doctor left it there. Outside, the sound of boots approached. The tent flap opened, and Sergeant O'Leary stepped in, hat low, breath fogging in the cold air. He stood there for a moment, eyes on the sleeping woman, then on Dawson. "You made yourself the talk of the camp," he said flatly. Dawson didn't look up. "That a good thing or a bad thing?" "Neither," O'Leary said. Just loud." He shifted his weight. "A command's heard. They want a report in the morning. You'll likely be pulled off duty." Dawson finally met his gaze. "Pulled off feeding starving prisoners?" "Pulled off breaking the chain of command," O'Leary shot back. His tone softened just enough to show it wasn't anger anymore, but something closer to fatigue. "You know this war ain't clean, cowboy. It's rules and orders, and pretending that's what keeps it from falling apart." Dawson leaned back in his chair. "Funny thing, Sarge. Every man out there thinks he's keeping something together. But I've been watching it come apart since '42. O'Leary said nothing for a while. The lantern hissed. Finally he muttered, "Get some sleep. I'll handle the report." He turned to leave, then stopped. "You did right by her. But don't expect anyone to say it." Dawson nodded once. "Didn't do it for that." When O'Leary was gone, the quiet settled again. The woman stirred, eyes opening just enough to see him there. Her lips moved, the words faint, German and halting. Dawson didn't understand, but he caught one thing, a whisper that sounded like Danke. He smiled slightly, tipped his hat, and said, "Rest easy." She fell back into sleep. By morning, the camp was buzzing again. A convoy had arrived with supplies and a colonel from Division Command. The men straightened their uniforms, brushed the frost from their coats, and tried to look like the war hadn't worn them thin. Dawson kept to the edge, feeding the horses, pretending not to notice the glances that followed him. The colonel inspected the perimeter, the barracks, the prisoners. He was tall, sharp-jawed, the kind who still believed paperwork could hold the world steady. When he reached Dawson, he stopped. "You're the one they're talking about," he said. "Yes, sir." "You defied a direct order. Provided aid to enemy personnel. You aware that's against regulation?" "Yes, sir." Dawson didn't flinch. "I figured regulations didn't cover starving women." The colonel studied him. "You think compassion wins wars, Private?" "No, sir," Dawson said quietly. "But maybe it keeps us human enough to remember what we're fighting for." The colonel's eyes narrowed, then flicked toward the infirmary tent. "Is she still alive?" "There she is." He gave a short nod. Good. Write your statement. Sergeant O'Leary will forward it. That'll be all." And with that, he walked off, boots crunching the frost. When he was gone, O'Leary approached, half a grin tugging at his mouth. "You might have just talked yourself out of a court-martial." "Guess I'll take that," Dawson said. The next few days passed without punishment. The colonel left, and new orders came down, transfer of the female POWs to a medical camp near Bremen. Trucks arrived at dawn, and the prisoners were gathered by the gate. Most were too weak to climb up on their own. Dawson helped lift them one by one, hands careful, words soft. When he came to the woman he'd saved, she looked up at him with something close to recognition. She reached out and touched his sleeve, light as a feather. He didn't say anything, just gave her the canteen he'd kept full since that morning. She nodded, lips trembling. "A cowboy," she whispered, her accent breaking the word in two. He smiled and tipped his hat again. "That's me." As the truck rumbled to life, O'Leary stood beside him, watching the convoy pull away. "You think they'll make it?" "Some will," Dawson said. "Some always do." The two men stood in silence as the trucks disappeared over the ridge, leaving only dust and the echo of the engines. Around them, the camp went back to its routine, the guards pacing, the cooks banging pots, the same gray rhythm of survival. But something in it had shifted. The laughter that used to follow Dawson's nickname was gone. When someone called him a cowboy now, it carried a different weight, half respect, half reminder. That evening he rode out beyond the wire, up the small rise overlooking the valley. The sun was setting low, bleeding red into the snow patches. He took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and exhaled slowly. In the distance, the convoy was a faint line moving west, the last truck's dust curling up into the gold light. He thought of all the things the war had taken, friends, certainty, sleep, and how this one act, small and foolish as it was, had given something back. Not victory. Not peace. Just a kind of clarity. He turned his horse toward camp as the first stars appeared. Behind him, the land was quiet again. Tomorrow would bring orders, inspections, maybe a transfer. But tonight, he allowed himself a rare thought, that decency, even in ruins, still had a place in a soldier's heart. When he reached the gate, O'Leary was there, leaning on the post, cigarette glowing in the dark. "You get your ride?" he asked. "Yeah," Dawson said. "I just needed to see the road." O'Leary nodded. "A hell of a week, cowboy." "Hell of a war," Dawson replied. They stood there a moment longer, the night air sharp, the silence heavy but not empty. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and for the first time in months, Dawson almost smiled.